I had always believed that a man's last will and testament was meant to provide for his family, to leave a legacy of care. I never imagined that after 45 years of marriage, my husband's final words from the grave would be a declaration of war. His death, you see, was not the end of my suffering. It was merely the beginning of a meticulously crafted torture designed to break what little was left of me. But in his arrogance, my husband Dennis made one fatal miscalculation. He believed he had extinguished every last ember of the woman I once was, but all his cruelty did was fan a single, forgotten spark into a flame. Hello, my dear friends. My name is Brenda, and I am 90 years old. I'm speaking to you today from my home in a quiet corner of Connecticut, a house that has held more secrets and sorrow than you could ever imagine. It is from here that I want to share the most painful story of my life, a journey that took me to the very edge of sanity, but ultimately revealed a strength I never knew I possessed. Please subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on this video. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? It always brings a warmth to my old heart to know how far my words can travel. My story truly begins in the early 50s, when I was a young woman with a heart full of simple dreams. I wasn't from a family of any particular note or wealth. My parents were good, hard-working people who believed in kindness and integrity above all else. I worked as a clerk in a small downtown office, and my life was a quiet tapestry of modest hopes, to one day have a family, a home of my own, and a love that was steady and true. Then I met Dennis. He was not just a man, he was an event. 9 years my senior, he was already a prominent figure in our community, a successful businessman who seemed to possess an aura of unshakable confidence. He moved with a purpose that made everyone else seem to be standing still. When his attention turned to me, a quiet girl from a humble background, it felt like being struck by lightning. I, and everyone around me, was completely dazzled. Our courtship was a whirlwind, something out of the pages of a magazine. He took me to restaurants I'd only ever read about, bought me flowers that filled my parents' small home with an intoxicating perfume, and introduced me to a world of privilege and sophistication that was utterly foreign to me. He was charming, attentive, and unfailingly generous. My parents were overjoyed. "You've caught the biggest fish in the sea, my darling Brenda," my mother would say, her eyes shining with pride. "A man like him is a blessing. He will take care of you for the rest of your life." I believed her. I believed with all the sincerity of my hopeful heart that I was the luckiest girl in the world. We were married in the spring of 1953 at the Grand Stone Church on the town green. It was a lavish affair, the talk of the town for months. My dress was a confection of satin and lace, a gift from Dennis, of course, and as I walked down the aisle, I saw a future shimmering with promise. Everything seemed perfect. Perhaps, looking back now, it was too perfect. The first year of our marriage was a continuation of that beautiful dream. We lived in a magnificent house on a tree-lined street, a home so large I sometimes felt lost in it. Dennis even hired a live-in housekeeper, Annette, a kind and discreet woman who managed the household with quiet efficiency. I thought I was living a fairy tale, the kind I used to read about in books. I was Mrs. Dennis, a respected wife to a respected man, and I wanted for nothing. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the beautiful facade began to crack. It started with small things, little remarks that pricked at my confidence like tiny needles. "A woman of my stature shouldn't have such a loud laugh, Brenda," he'd say with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You must learn to carry yourself with more restraint." Or, "That dress is lovely, my dear, but perhaps a bit simple for the wife of a man in my position." His words hurt, but I accepted them as well-intentioned guidance. I told myself he was only trying to help me adjust to my new social standing, to mold me into the kind of wife he could be proud of. I was so eager to please him, so desperate to prove I was worthy of the life he had given me. I know some of you will understand this feeling, this deep-seated desire to be the perfect wife, the perfect partner, even if it means sanding down the edges of who you are. Soon, the gentle guidance sharpened into cutting criticism. He began to target my background, my family, my education. He'd mock the simple values my parents had instilled in me, calling them provincial and unsophisticated. When we had guests for dinner, he developed a cruel habit of turning my minor slips of etiquette into public humiliations, recounting a story of my charming naivete with a laugh that made everyone at the table uncomfortable, while I sat frozen, my cheeks burning with shame. He was a master at it, disguising his cruelty as sophisticated humor, so that only I felt the true sting of his words. Then came the isolation, a slow and methodical process. He found reasons for me to stop seeing my old friends. "You have nothing in common with them anymore, Brenda," he would reason, his tone patient and logical. "Your lives are on different paths now. It's only natural that you drift apart." He discouraged visits from my family, always scheduling important business dinners or social events on the weekends they planned to come. "We have obligations, my dear. You must understand." Little by little, my world shrank until it contained only him and, in the periphery, the silent, watchful presence of Annette. The years bled into one another, each one spent inside that gilded cage. Dennis controlled every single aspect of my life. He chose my clothes, vetted the books I read, and even dictated what we ate for dinner. He managed all the finances, of course, providing me with a small household allowance as one might give to a child. "A woman's mind isn't suited for the complexities of finance," he would state, not as an opinion, but as an indisputable fact. That is the husband's burden to bear. Worst of all were his affairs, which he eventually stopped bothering to hide. I would find receipts from expensive restaurants I had never been to, the lingering scent of another woman's perfume on his suits, gifts of jewelry bought that were never meant for me. When I finally summoned the courage to confront him, he didn't even have the decency to deny it. He simply laughed, a cold, dismissive sound. "A wife who fulfills her duties properly has no reason to worry about such trivialities," he said, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. If he sought comfort elsewhere, it was my failure. I tried to leave him. I truly did. Twice in the first decade, I packed a small bag while he was at work, my hands trembling, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope. But he always knew. It was as if he could read my mind. He would come home early, find me by the door, and then the manipulation would begin. Sometimes he would weep, promising he would change, telling me he couldn't live without me. Other times, he would use veiled threats. "Where would you go, Brenda? Back to your parents' little house? You are nothing without me. You have nothing without my name." And the most shameful part is that I believed him. After years of his conditioning, I felt worthless, incapable, and completely dependent. I had no job, no money of my own, no confidence left. So I would unpack my bag, and the cycle would continue. We never had children. In the beginning, Dennis claimed we had all the time in the world, that we should first secure our social standing. As the years passed, the excuses wore thin, until one evening he delivered the cruelest blow of all. "I could never risk diluting my bloodline with your background, my dear," he said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "My legacy requires a stronger stock." That night, I wept until there were no tears left, mourning the children I would never have, and the last remnants of my self-worth. The final decades of our marriage were the hardest. As Dennis grew older, his charm faded, leaving behind only a bitter, angry man. His days were spent finding fault with everything I did, from the way I arranged the flowers to the way I breathed. I was a constant disappointment, a burden he was forced to endure. I lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, walking on eggshells, my only goal to make it through each day without triggering one of his cold, terrifying rages. Then, one morning in the spring of 1998, Dennis suffered a massive heart attack in his study. He was 72. I remember standing in the doorway, watching the paramedics working on him, and feeling a profound and shocking sense of relief. A wave of it washed over me, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. The monster was gone. At last, I was free, or so I foolishly believed. 3 weeks after the funeral, I was summoned to the office of Mr. Peterson, the family lawyer, for the reading of the will. I sat in the plush leather chair opposite his large mahogany desk, feeling a quiet sense of anticipation. I assumed Dennis would have left me the house and a comfortable portion of his assets, as was customary. I wasn't greedy. I just wanted enough to live out my remaining years in peace, to finally have a life of my own. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat, his expression uncharacteristically grim. "Mrs. Brenda," he began, refusing to meet my eyes, "your late husband has drafted a most unusual will." He paused, shuffling the papers before him. "He does, in fact, bequeath to you his entire fortune, which is estimated to be quite substantial. However, it is conditional." My heart, which had felt so light just moments before, turned to a block of ice in my chest. Conditional? What kind of conditions? "You are required to complete 12 tasks, he said, his voice low and strained. 1 task per month for a full year. The instructions for each task are contained within 12 sealed envelopes, which I am to give you at the beginning of each month. If you fail to complete even one of these tasks to the letter, or if you decide to stop at any point, the entire inheritance will be forfeited and transferred to a charity of your husband's choosing." I was stunned into silence. "But what are the tasks?" I finally managed to whisper. Mr. Peterson looked deeply uncomfortable. "I am not privy to the details, Mrs. Brenda. Your husband delivered these envelopes to me himself, with very specific instructions. This is the first." He slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the desk. My name was written on the front, in Dennis's sharp, elegant script. My fingers trembled as I took it. Back in the sterile quiet of the waiting room, I broke the wax seal. Inside was a multi-page letter, every line filled with his familiar handwriting, a script I had once found so distinguished and now saw as the scratching of a claw. "My dearest Brenda," it began, the words dripping with mock affection. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. Did you really think my death would be your grand escape? You have always been so naive. Death will not stop me from reminding you of your place in this world. Over the next year, you will learn that even from 6 feet under, I am still in control of your pathetic existence." The words were a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The letter went on to detail the first task. It was an act of refined cruelty that could only have been conceived by him. I was to host a formal dinner party in honor of Glenda, his primary mistress for the last 20 years. But that was not all. At this dinner, surrounded by our former friends and associates, I was to stand up and give a speech, thanking her for the joy and companionship she had brought to my husband's life. I was to prepare the meal myself, serve her and her hand-picked guests as if I were a common maid, and praise the woman who had been a symbol of my deepest humiliation. "You have 1 month to arrange this soiree," the letter concluded. "Glenda has been informed and is eagerly awaiting your invitation. Should you refuse or fail to follow my instructions precisely, you will lose everything, and do not for a moment think you can cheat. I have made arrangements to ensure your full compliance." I stumbled out of the law office in a daze, clutching the letter to my chest. He had done it. He had found a way to continue torturing me from beyond the grave. For 45 years, he had systematically dismantled my spirit, and now he had laid a path of 12 final humiliations to utterly annihilate what was left. He had meticulously planned this, savoring the thought of my suffering long after he was gone. But what Dennis, in all his cunning, could never have planned for was what lay hidden in the back of his study drawer. A secret he kept for 45 years, a secret that would ultimately become my weapon. That, however, was a discovery for another day. On that cold afternoon, all I could feel was the crushing weight of his dead hand, reaching out from the grave to wrap itself around my throat one last time. I drove home from the lawyer's office in a fog, the hateful letter lying on the passenger seat like a venomous snake. The familiar streets of my town, the stately homes, the manicured lawns, it all seemed alien, a backdrop for a play in which I was the unwilling star. When I walked into my own house, the silence was deafening. For so many years, this house had been a prison of quiet tension, every creak of the floorboards a potential prelude to Dennis's disapproval. Now, it was a tomb, and my husband was its ghost, his malevolence lingering in the very air I breathed. I sat in the formal living room, a space we only ever used for entertaining, and stared at the letter. My mind raced, a frantic torrent of impossible choices. I could refuse. I could tear up the letter, throw the other 11 envelopes into the fire when they arrived, and walk away. But to where? At 86 years old, with no savings of my own, no family left to turn to, I would be destitute. The inheritance Dennis dangled before me was more than money. It was survival. It was the difference between living out my last years with a roof over my head and dying in poverty, a fate he knew I feared more than anything. He had engineered this perfectly. He had stripped me of all resources over 45 years, ensuring I had no other choice but to dance to his tune, even after the fiddler himself was dead. I must have sat there for hours, lost in a stupor of despair, because the afternoon light had faded to a dusty twilight when Annette found me. She came in to turn on the lamps, her movements soft and unobtrusive as always. She had been with us for over 30 years, a silent witness to the slow erosion of my soul. She saw me clutching the letter, saw the tears tracking silently down my cheeks, and for the first time in our long acquaintance, she crossed the invisible line between employee and employer. "Mrs. Brenda," she asked, her voice gentle, "is everything all right? The lawyer's office." Her quiet concern was the key that unlocked the dam of my composure. A sob tore from my throat, a raw, ragged sound that shocked us both. I held out the letter, my hand shaking too violently to hold it steady. She took it from me and stood under the lamplight, her brow furrowed in concentration as she read. I watched her expression shift from professional concern to confusion, then to disbelief, and finally to a look of pure, unadulterated outrage. When she finished, she lowered the pages, her knuckles white. "That man!" she whispered, her voice trembling with a fury I had never seen in her before. "That man was a monster. To do this to you, even now. What am I going to do, Annette?" I wept. "How can I possibly do this? Invite her into this house. Thank her." "You will do no such thing," she said, her voice suddenly firm, protective. "You will tell that lawyer to take his will and his envelopes, and you will... She trailed off, the harsh reality of my situation dawning on her as well. We both knew I had no other options. "He's left me with nothing else," I said, the words tasting like ash. "It's either this or the street." Annette was quiet for a long moment. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table, then sat in the armchair opposite me. "When I first came to work here," she began, her voice soft again, "I thought you were the luckiest woman alive. This beautiful house, a successful husband. But it didn't take long to see the truth. I saw the way he looked at you when he thought no one was watching, the way you would flinch when he raised his voice. I heard the things he said to you, the little cuts, the constant criticisms. I wanted to say something so many times, but I was afraid Afraid for my job, yes, but mostly afraid for you. Afraid it would only make things worse for you if I interfered. Her confession was a strange comfort. For decades, I had felt so utterly alone in my suffering, believing I was hiding it so well. To know that someone else had seen, had understood, made the burden feel infinitesimally lighter. "You're not alone in this, Mrs. Brenda," she said, as if reading my thoughts. "Whatever that devil has planned for you, we will face it together." Her words gave me a sliver of strength. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get me through the night. The next morning, I awoke with the grim resolve of a soldier marching toward a battle they know they cannot win. My first task was to contact Glenda. It took me 3 hours to work up the courage to dial her number, a number I'd found years ago on a forgotten telephone bill and committed to memory like a verse from a nightmare. My hand hovered over the receiver, my stomach churning with a mixture of dread and humiliation. Finally, I took a deep breath and dialed. She answered on the second ring, her voice as smooth and self-satisfied as I remembered. "Hello? Glenda, this is Brenda." There was a pause, and then a low, cruel chuckle. "Brenda, darling, I was wondering when you'd call. Dennis told me all about his little posthumous project. Isn't he just the most imaginative man you've ever known? Always thinking ahead." Her gloating tone was like acid in my ears. I felt my resolve crumble. "I'm calling to invite you to dinner, as per his instructions." "Of course you are," she purred. "I've already cleared my calendar." "Let's say the last Saturday of the month? That gives you plenty of time to prepare. And I've taken the liberty of compiling a guest list. Dennis always said I had a better head for social occasions than you did. There will be 8 of us in total. I'll have my secretary send the names over to you. Oh, and for the menu, I'm feeling celebratory. Let's do a standing rib roast, the best cut, of course. And make sure the champagne is properly chilled. The good kind, not the cheap swill you'd probably choose." Every word was a calculated twist of the knife. She was enjoying this, relishing her power, her victory. She was no longer just the other woman. She was the master of ceremonies for my degradation. "And Brenda," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "that little speech you're supposed to make, do try to make it sound sincere. Dennis will be watching, you know." I hung up the phone, my body trembling with a rage so profound it left me breathless. For 45 years I had swallowed my anger, pushed down my resentment, and presented a placid face to the world. But this was a new level of violation. This was a desecration of my home, my life, my grief. What little of it wasn't eclipsed by relief. The next 3 weeks were a blur of nightmarish preparations. I moved through my days like an automaton, my mind blessedly numb. Annette helped where she could, her presence a silent, steady source of support. Together, we polished the silver, washed the crystal, and aired out the fine linen tablecloths, all the ceremonial trappings of a life that had been a complete and utter lie. Shopping for the ingredients Glenda had demanded was a trial in itself. The butcher, a man who had known Dennis for years, gave me a pitying look as I ordered the expensive cut of meat. "A special occasion, Mrs. Brenda?" he asked kindly. I simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The day of the dinner arrived, a gray, overcast Saturday that matched the mood of my heart. As I worked in the kitchen, the familiar space felt alien. I was not a hostess preparing a meal for friends. I was an inmate preparing my own execution. Annette had offered to do all the cooking, but I refused. The letter had been specific. I was to prepare the meal. It was part of the humiliation. The guests began to arrive at 7. They were all people from our old social circle, men Dennis had done business with, and their perfectly coiffed wives. They greeted me with strained smiles and awkward condolences, their eyes flickering around the room, hungry for the drama that was about to unfold. I saw the pity in some of their expressions, the morbid curiosity in others. I was a spectacle, the mad widow of a prominent man, performing a final bizarre act of devotion. Glenda was the last to arrive, making an entrance as if she were the queen of a royal court. She was poised and elegant, accepting my stiff greeting with a triumphant smile. "Brenda, the house looks lovely," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You really do know how to keep things nice when you put your mind to it." Dennis was right. The evening was the single most difficult experience of my life. I served the meal, moving between the kitchen and the dining room, my back aching, my spirit shrinking with every trip. I filled wine glasses, cleared plates, and answered polite questions with monosyllabic responses, all while Glenda held court at the head of my table. My table. She regaled the guests with stories about her travels with Dennis, intimate little anecdotes that made it painfully clear how much of his life had been lived without me. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to challenge her. Then, after the dessert plates were cleared, Glenda tapped her glass with a spoon, a sharp crystalline sound that silenced the room. "I believe," she said, her eyes fixed on me, "that our hostess has something she'd like to say." Every eye in the room turned to me. I stood by the sideboard, clutching a napkin, my hands slick with sweat. This was it, the moment Dennis had surely pictured with sadistic glee. I felt my throat close, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the faces around the table, a sea of polite curiosity and veiled judgment. I wanted to scream, to curse his name, to throw the rest of the dessert at the wall. But I thought of the alternative, the cold, lonely years of poverty, and the fight went out of me. I took a deep breath and began to recite the words Dennis had written for me, words I had been forced to memorize. "My dear friends," I began, my voice a hollow echo of itself, "thank you for being here tonight. This evening is a special one. It is an opportunity for me to publicly thank Glenda." I forced myself to look at her. She was beaming, her expression one of pure, unadulterated triumph. "For so many years," I continued, each word a betrayal of my own heart, "Glenda brought a great deal of joy and happiness into my husband's life. Her sincere affection and loyal presence were a source of immense comfort to him, especially in his later years. She understood him in a way that I, as his wife, perhaps never could. And for that, I am grateful." A thick, suffocating silence descended on the room. The guests stared at their plates, at their hands, anywhere but at me. I had debased myself completely. I had not only validated her role in my husband's life, I had elevated it above my own. I had become the architect of my own disgrace. The party ended quickly after that. The guests, unable to bear the oppressive awkwardness any longer, made their excuses and fled into the night, leaving me alone in the wreckage. Glenda was the last to leave. She paused at the door and placed a hand on my arm, her touch feeling like a brand. "You did very well, Brenda," she whispered, her voice laced with mock sympathy. "Dennis would have been so proud." After she was gone, I stood motionless in the hallway for a long time. The house was filled with the debris of the party, dirty dishes, empty glasses, the lingering scent of Glenda's perfume. Annette began to quietly clear the table, her movements efficient and silent. She didn't say a word, but her presence was a small anchor in my sea of despair. I didn't cry. I was beyond tears. I felt hollowed out, a fragile shell of a person who had just performed the ultimate act of self-annihilation. Dennis had won. The first task was complete. I had proven myself to be exactly the weak, obedient creature he had spent a lifetime creating. The next morning, a familiar cream-colored envelope was in the mailbox. My heart sank. Task number 2. I carried it inside, my hands trembling as I broke the seal. The first task had attacked my dignity, my role as a wife. But as I read the first line of the new letter, a cold dread washed over me because I realized this next task was designed to destroy my very soul. It read, "Congratulations on your successful dinner party, my dear. I hope you enjoyed finally giving Glenda the respect she has always deserved. But that was a simple social pleasantry. This month, we will begin the real work. This month, you will learn the meaning of true repentance." The letter went on to describe the second task, a penance so steeped in Gothic cruelty I could hardly believe it was real. For the entire next month, every single day, without exception, I was to go to the cemetery where he was buried. I was to kneel before his cold marble headstone for 1 hour, and I was to recite out loud a prayer of contrition that he himself had written. In this prayer, I was to beg his forgiveness for my failings as a wife, for squandering the opportunities he had provided, and for being an unworthy partner to an exceptional man. But that was not the worst of it. My daily humiliation was to be a matter of public record. Dennis had arranged for the cemetery groundskeeper, a man named Mr. Henderson, to verify my attendance each day and to ensure I was reciting the full prayer. A logbook was to be kept. If I missed a single day, or if my performance was deemed insincere by the witness, I would forfeit everything. A wave of nausea washed over me. To perform my private shame as a public spectacle, it was a level of degradation I had not thought possible. For the first few days of the month, I was paralyzed. I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of kneeling on the cold ground, mouthing those obscene lies while a stranger took notes, was too much to bear. But with each passing day, the reality of my financial situation grew more stark. The household accounts were dwindling. Soon, I wouldn't have enough money for groceries, let alone to keep the lights on in this cavernous house. On the 4th day of the month, defeated, I drove to the cemetery. It was a cold, windswept afternoon. Mr. Henderson, a stoic man who seemed perpetually unimpressed by the grief surrounding him, met me at the gate with a clipboard. He nodded curtly and pointed toward the hill where Dennis's ostentatious gravestone stood, a monument to his own ego. I walked the path as if I were a condemned prisoner on my way to the gallows. I knelt on the damp earth, the cold seeping through my coat. Then, pulling the hateful, memorized words from the depths of my mind, I began to speak to the stone. "My dearest Dennis," I whispered, my voice cracking, "I come before you today to beg your forgiveness. I was a disappointing wife, blind to your greatness and ungrateful for your generosity." I recited the entire 10-minute text, my voice a monotone of misery. Mr. Henderson stood a respectful distance away, his pen scratching on the clipboard. Other visitors to the cemetery would slow their walk as they passed, their faces a mixture of confusion, pity, and morbid fascination. Who was this old woman, kneeling in the dirt, talking to a grave? What terrible sin must she have committed to deserve such a public penance? Their unspoken questions were almost as loud as the hateful words I was forced to speak. And so it went, day after day. For 30 days I performed my ritual of shame. I knelt in the biting wind, in the pouring rain, and on the few bright, sunny days that seemed to mock my suffering. I recited the litany of my supposed failures until the words lost all meaning and became just a meaningless drone. I felt my identity chipping away with each passing hour, replaced by this new role Dennis had assigned me, the penitent sinner. At the end of the month, as I completed my final hour, Mr. Henderson approached me. "That's it, ma'am," he said, his tone flat. "The month is done. I'll send the logbook to the lawyer." He paused, then added in a slightly softer voice, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry you had to go through that." It was a small kindness, but in my starved state, it felt like a banquet. I thought foolishly that nothing could be worse than what I had just endured. I was wrong. The third envelope arrived the next morning. When I read its contents, I understood Dennis's diabolical plan. He wasn't just trying to humiliate me, he was systematically stripping me of everything and everyone who offered any comfort. He was burning every bridge, ensuring that by the end of the year I would be utterly and completely alone, a hollowed-out vessel entirely dependent on his money. The third task was monstrous. It was an act of profound and unforgivable betrayal. I was to fire Annette, but I was not simply to dismiss her. I was to accuse her publicly of theft. I was to claim she had been stealing silverware and my personal jewelry for years, and I was to do it in front of witnesses whom Dennis had already designated, one of his former business partners and the man's wife. After the accusation, I was to file a formal police report against her. Annette has always been a disloyal and resentful servant, the letter read, his words a venomous lie. It is time she faced the consequences for her thievery. I have prepared a small box of evidence for you. Pawn shop receipts I have forged, and several missing items that you will find in the back of her closet where I had them placed. If you do not follow these instructions, not only will you lose the inheritance, but I have made separate arrangements with a former associate to ensure that an anonymous tip is sent to the police anyway. She will be ruined one way or another. The only choice you have is whether you will be ruined with her. This time, I truly thought I would break. This was not about my own dignity. This was about destroying the life of an innocent woman, a woman who had shown me more loyalty and kindness than anyone on earth. Annette was my only friend, my only confidant. To do this to her, it was unthinkable. It was evil. I sat with the letter for 2 days, my insides twisted into a knot of agony. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. The choice was clear. Either I destroyed Annette, or we were both destroyed. Dennis had constructed the perfect trap, a moral checkmate from which there was no escape. On the third night, I was wandering through the silent house, half mad with grief and indecision, when I found myself standing outside his study. The room had been untouched since his death, a shrine to his power and arrogance. We women of a certain age know what it is to keep a home, to pour our lives into its silent corners, and sometimes to be the ones who unearth the secrets buried there. On a sudden impulse, driven by a desperate need to feel some sense of control, I decided to begin clearing out his desk. It was a massive piece of furniture, dark and imposing like the man who had owned it. I emptied drawers filled with old financial statements, business correspondence, and expensive pens that had signed who knows how many cruel decrees. It was in the bottom right-hand drawer that I found it. The drawer was stuck, refusing to open more than a few inches. Frustrated, I gave it a hard yank. There was a crack of splintering wood, and the drawer came free. Wedged in the back, caught behind the runner, was a small, black, leather-bound notebook. It looked like a diary. Thinking it was just an old appointment book, I opened it. The first page was dated March 15, 1952, just a few weeks after we had met. The handwriting was unmistakably Dennis's, but the words were those of a stranger, a cold and calculating scientist observing a specimen. Initial observation of the subject, Brenda, is promising, he had written. Her docile nature, combined with a modest background and a palpable eagerness to please, makes her an ideal candidate for the experiment. She genuinely believes my interest is romantic. This level of naivete is fascinating. It is a perfect blank slate upon which to work. My hands began to shake so violently I could barely hold the book. Experiment? Subject? What was he talking about? I read on, my blood turning to ice. June 2nd, 1952. The courtship phase is proceeding perfectly. Subject is utterly captivated. The gifts, the dinners, they are simple, effective tools of conditioning. Her family is equally enthralled, which will be crucial for the later stages of isolation. She believes she is entering a fairy tale. She has no idea she is entering a laboratory. My goal is simple: to see if it is possible to systematically deconstruct a human personality and rebuild it to my exact specifications. Can a person be taught to erase their own identity? I had to sit down. The room swam before my eyes. My entire life, our entire life together, was a lie. It wasn't a failed romance. It wasn't a difficult marriage. It was a deliberate, sadistic experiment. He had never loved me. He had never even seen me as a person. I was a thing to be observed, manipulated, and broken for his own intellectual amusement. I flipped through the pages, a horrific chronicle of my own destruction, all detailed in his cold, detached prose. September 12, 1953, Phase 1, Subversion of Confidence, is a success. My small, consistent criticisms of her speech, dress, and manners are yielding excellent results. The subject now second-guesses her every move and constantly seeks my approval. Her innate sense of self is already beginning to fracture. Next, I will begin severing her external support systems. February 3, 1955. The isolation phase is nearly complete. The subject has ceased contact with most of her pre-marriage friends, and her family visits have dwindled to almost zero, thanks to my careful scheduling of social obligations. She now relies on me for almost all human contact. The next variable to introduce will be infidelity. I am curious to see how she processes a betrayal when she has no one to turn to for validation. August 15, 1956. The first affair has been successfully integrated. Subject discovered letters from a woman named Colette, as planned. The resulting emotional distress was remarkable. Tears, pleas, but no substantive move to leave the marital unit. She is beginning to accept that she is not deserving of fidelity. The conditioning holds. The experiment is progressing beyond my most optimistic projections. I slammed the notebook shut, a strangled cry escaping my lips. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. 45 years of my life, explained away in a few dozen pages of clinical psychopathic observation. I was not his wife. I was his magnum opus, a masterpiece of psychological torture. The discovery changed everything, and yet it changed nothing. A cold, hard rage began to form in my heart, a feeling so foreign and yet so powerful it almost choked me. He had not just been a cruel husband. He was a monster of a different order entirely. This knowledge was a terrible, searing light, illuminating the dark corners of my past. But the letter was still on the table downstairs. The third task still awaited. I still had to walk down those stairs and tell Annette, my only friend, that I was going to destroy her. Now, though, I understood why. It wasn't just random cruelty. It was a necessary step in his experiment. To complete my isolation, to break my final bond to humanity. He had written it himself. He needed to see if his creation, his perfectly conditioned subject, would obey even the most monstrous command. The discovery of the journal was like being pulled from a deep, dark ocean, only to be left stranded on a barren rock in the middle of a raging storm. I had the truth, but the truth was a weapon I didn't yet know how to wield, and the immediate, monstrous reality of the third task remained. I still had to destroy Annette. For 2 days, I held that terrible knowledge, the journal hidden beneath the linens in my closet, its presence a dark, burning secret. I felt its weight in every room I entered. I wonder if any of you have ever had to make a truly impossible choice, a choice where every path leads to a different kind of heartbreak. Do I sacrifice my only friend to secure my own survival? Or do I defy my dead husband's command and condemn us both to ruin? In the end, it was Dennis's own words, his cold, clinical description of his experiment, that showed me the way. He expected me to obey like an automaton. He had designed this task specifically to sever my last human connection, to ensure my complete and utter isolation. And I realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that the most defiant thing I could do was to obey him on the surface while secretly doing the exact opposite of what he intended. He wanted to break my bond with Annette. I would make it unbreakable. That evening, I went to Annette's room in the attic. She was packing a small suitcase, her movements slow and resigned. She had read the letter. I had left it on the kitchen table, unable to speak the words myself. She looked up at me, her expression not of anger, but of profound, bottomless sorrow. "I'll be gone in the morning, Mrs. Brenda," she said quietly, "before the witnesses arrive." "Don't call me that any more, Annette," I said, my voice hoarse. "My name is Brenda, and you're not going anywhere until you've listened to me." I closed the door behind me, sat on the edge of her bed, and for the first time in my life, I told someone the complete truth. I told her about Dennis, about the criticisms, the isolation, the affairs, the slow, methodical grinding down of my spirit. And then, I retrieved the journal. "He called it an experiment, Annette," I said, my hands shaking as I held out the little black book. "My whole life, it was all a game to him." We sat there for hours, under the single bare bulb of her attic room, and I read his words aloud. I read her the passages about his cold-blooded selection of me as his subject, his methodical plans to break me, his detached observations of my pain. As I read, Annette's sorrow began to curdle into a slow-burning rage that mirrored my own. The man she had worked for, the man whose house she had kept for 3 decades, was not just a cruel employer. He was a psychopath. "That's why he wants me gone," she said, her voice a low growl when I finished. "He knew I saw things. He knew I was the only person left who cared about you. This is his final move to leave you with absolutely no one." "Yes," I said, "and that is why we have to let him think he's won. Annette, I have to ask you to do the impossible. I have to ask you to let me do this to you. Let me accuse you. Let me humiliate you. Let me call the police. We have to play our parts in his sick little play because it's the only way I can get the inheritance. And I need that money, not for me, but to find a way to make him pay for what he's done to us." She stared at me, her mind processing the enormity of my request. I was asking her to sacrifice her reputation, her name, her future, on the gamble that I could somehow find justice at the end of this nightmarish road. "He has a box of evidence," I continued, my voice desperate. "Forged receipts, things he planted in this very room. He'll ruin you anyway if I don't do this. But if we do it my way, we do it together. I will give you enough money to live comfortably until this is over. You can stay with your sister, and I swear to you, on my life, the very first thing I do when this is over is clear your name. I will shout the truth from the rooftops if I have to." Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow anymore. They were tears of anger and of fierce, unexpected loyalty. "All right, Brenda," she said, and hearing my first name on her lips felt like a revolution. "All right, we'll do it. Let's give the bastard the show he always wanted." The next morning was the most difficult performance of my life. The witnesses, Roger and his wife Teresa, arrived at 10 o'clock. They were a couple we had known for years, and they wore identical expressions of pained embarrassment. Roger was one of the men Dennis respected, a hard-nosed businessman cut from the same cloth. I led them into the living room, Annette standing silently by the fireplace, her head bowed. I recited my lines, the false, venomous words Dennis had scripted for me. I spoke of missing silver, of my mother's pearls, of years of misplaced trust. With every lie that passed my lips, a piece of me shriveled and died, even knowing it was an act. "I'm so sorry to have to burden you with this," I said to Roger, my voice trembling with feigned distress. "But Dennis always said you were the most honorable man he knew, and I needed a witness." Roger nodded gravely, while Teresa looked at Annette with undisguised contempt. And Annette. She played her part to perfection. She gasped. She protested her innocence. She wept with a realism that tore my own heart to shreds. It was a horrific, gut-wrenching piece of theater. At the end, I told her to pack her things and leave my house immediately. The sight of her walking down the long driveway, carrying a single worn suitcase, will haunt me until the day I die. It was the loneliest moment of my life. I had done it. I had become the cruel, heartless woman Dennis had always wanted me to be. Roger and Teresa left soon after, murmuring empty condolences, leaving me in the suffocating silence of my now empty home. I had never felt so alone, or so determined. That afternoon, my compliance was rewarded. The lawyer called to confirm that Mr. Henderson's logbook had been received and that Roger had called him to verify that the unfortunate business with the housekeeper had been handled according to Dennis's instructions. I had passed the third test. Now, truly alone, I turned my attention back to the journal. This single notebook only covered the first few years of our marriage, but he had been observing and documenting for 45 years. Where were the others? A frantic energy seized me. I went back to the study, my new battleground, and began to search. I looked for false bottoms in drawers, hollowed-out books, loose floorboards. For days I searched, my obsession growing with every dead end. I knew they had to be somewhere. A man with an ego like Dennis's would never destroy his life's work. It was almost by accident that I found them. I was running my hands along the ornate, built-in bookshelves that lined one wall, pressing and pulling in frustration, when my hand brushed against a small, carved rosette in the molding. It felt loose. I twisted it. There was a soft click, and a section of the bookshelf swung inwards, revealing a dark, hidden cavity. And there they were. Lined up in a neat, chronological row were 15 more black leather-bound notebooks, identical to the first. An entire library of my life, written by my tormentor. My breath caught in my throat. It was a mausoleum of my stolen years. I pulled one out from the middle, dated a decade ago. January 9th, 1988. The subject's passivity is now almost total. She no longer expresses opinions on any matter of substance. Her personality has been successfully erased. As a test, I instructed her to burn her box of old family photographs, claiming they were a fire hazard. She complied without question, weeping silently as she did so. It was a fascinating display of conditioned obedience. I felt a surge of white-hot rage. I remembered that day. He had stood over me, his expression impassive, as I dropped the last images of my parents' faces into the flames. I had believed him. I had burned my own history because he told me to. The fourth envelope arrived on the 1st of the month. I opened it with a new sense of detachment. The task was, as expected, both absurd and humiliating. I was to go to the town hall and file a formal application to have my last name changed, on the grounds that I was too ashamed of my conduct as a wife to continue bearing the name of such a respectable man. Of course, the application would be denied, but the goal was the public spectacle, to have the town clerks and anyone within earshot witness the grief-stricken, unstable widow making a fool of herself. A month ago, this would have shattered me. Now it felt like just another move in a dark and twisted chess game. I went to the town hall. I stood before the clerk, a woman I had known for years, and I recited the insane request. I saw the look of alarm and pity in her eyes. I saw the whispers and stares from other people in the room. I played the part of the broken woman, just as Dennis had intended. But inside, I felt nothing but a cold, hard resolve. Every humiliation was a stepping stone. Every task I completed brought me 1 month closer to the inheritance, my war chest. That night, I sat in the study, surrounded by the 16 black journals. They were my evidence, my truth, my justification. For the first time, I did not feel like a subject in an experiment. I felt like a prosecutor building my case. I had 8 months left, 8 more tasks to endure. But it no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like a countdown. Dennis had thought he was writing the final chapter of my destruction. He had no idea he was merely writing the preface to my revenge. The next few months passed in a surreal rhythm of submission and subversion. On the surface, I was the perfect automaton Dennis had engineered. I dutifully performed the 4th task, humiliating myself at the town hall. I completed the 5th task, which required me to donate what little personal money I had secretly saved to a charity of Glenda's choosing, forcing me to stand on a small stage at their annual fundraiser and publicly state that I was making the donation to atone for my inadequacies as a wife. I even completed the 6th, a truly bizarre ordeal where I had to spend a week wearing one of Dennis's old, ill-fitting suits everywhere I went, a walking effigy of my own subjugation. I did it all with a placid, vacant expression. I played the part of a broken woman so convincingly that I sometimes frightened myself. But every night, I would retreat to the study, lock the door, and spread the 16 black journals across the desk. They were my secret fuel, my source of strength. I was no longer a victim enduring torture. I was an operative, gathering intelligence from deep within enemy territory. With each demeaning task I performed, I felt a grim satisfaction, knowing it was one step closer to the end of the year, one step closer to my day of reckoning. It was during one of these late-night sessions, deep into the 10th journal, that I found the entry that changed everything. It transformed my personal quest for survival into something far larger. The entry was dated just a few years before his death. Met with Roger, Clarence, and a few others for our monthly poker game, he wrote. The conversation, as it often does, turned to marital management. I find their clumsy attempts at control almost pathetic. They rely on shouting and overt intimidation, brutish and ineffective tools. I shared a few of my more nuanced techniques regarding psychological conditioning, specifically the principles of gaslighting and social isolation. Roger was particularly intrigued by the methodology of convincing a spouse that her own family is a negative influence. Clarence showed interest in financial control as a tool for fostering dependency. It is gratifying to see my research bearing fruit in other households. I am not merely running an experiment, I am founding a school of thought. I had to read the passage 3 times before the full, horrifying meaning sank in. Roger, Clarence. These were not just our friends, they were his disciples. My husband had not contained his evil within the walls of our home, he had exported it. He had taught other men how to torture their wives, creating a small, insidious club of domestic tyrants who exchanged tips on psychological abuse like they were stock market tips. Teresa, Roger's wife, who had watched me accuse Annette with such contempt, was she a victim too? And Yvonne, Clarence's quiet, perpetually nervous wife, was her anxiety the result of her husband's financial control? A cold dread washed over me. This was no longer just my story. How many other women were living in prisons they couldn't see, convinced, as I had been, that they were the flawed, crazy, difficult ones? The weight of this discovery was immense. I could no longer simply wait for the year to end, claim my inheritance, and disappear into a quiet life. I had a moral duty to these other women. Dennis's journals were not just the story of my abuse, they were the key to their freedom. I had to reach them. My first attempt was with Teresa. I knew Roger controlled their lives, so a direct visit was out of the question. I waited until I knew he would be at his weekly Rotary Club meeting and I called her. Her voice was hesitant, frail. "Teresa, it's Brenda." "Oh, Brenda," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Is everything all right? Roger doesn't like me to take unexpected calls." The phrase was a punch to the gut. It was a line I myself could have spoken 1,000 times. "I know, my dear, and I won't keep you," I said, trying to sound as gentle and non-threatening as possible. I was just calling because, since Dennis passed, I've been going through some of his old papers, and I found things that concerned me, things that mentioned Roger. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I don't know what you mean. Teresa, I know this is going to sound strange, but did Roger ever convince you that your sister was a bad influence on you? Did he ever make you feel that you had to choose between him and your family? The silence that followed was so long and profound, I thought she had hung up. When she finally spoke, her whisper was ragged. How could you know that? My sister and I, we haven't spoken in almost 10 years. He said she was jealous of our happiness. He was lying, Teresa, I said, my voice firm. He was lying because my husband, Dennis, taught him that isolating a wife from her family was an effective way to control her. I have it here, in Dennis's own handwriting. A sob, quickly stifled, came through the phone. I have to go, she whispered frantically. He'll be home soon. Please don't call again. The line went dead. I hung up, my heart aching for her, but a small spark of hope had been lit. I had planted a seed. The truth was out there, and it was a powerful, dangerous thing. For Yvonne, Clarence's wife, I knew a phone call would be useless. Clarence was a notorious miser who likely monitored their phone bills. I needed a different approach. I found out from a mutual acquaintance that Yvonne did the grocery shopping every Tuesday morning at the same market. The following Tuesday, I was there, pushing a cart through the aisles until I saw her in the dairy section. I staged a chance encounter. Yvonne, how lovely to see you, I said with a bright smile. She looked startled, her eyes darting around as if her husband might materialize from behind a display of cheeses. Brenda, hello, it's been a long time. I was so sorry to hear about Clarence's recent business troubles, I lied, a shot in the dark. Her eyes widened. What? No, his business is doing better than ever. Oh, I said, feigning confusion. Forgive me, Dennis must have misunderstood. In his journals, he mentioned that Clarence was implementing some aggressive financial controls at home, and I just assumed it was due to business pressures. I let the words hang in the air. Yvonne's face went pale. His journals? Yes, he kept meticulous diaries. He wrote about everything, including his conversations with Clarence about how strictly controlling a wife's access to money could make her more appreciative. I'm sure I misunderstood the context. She stared at me, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. For years, she had been forced to ask her wealthy husband for money for every little thing, to justify every penny, to live with the constant, low-grade humiliation of a grown woman on a child's allowance. I could see in her eyes that my words had just provided a stunning, terrible explanation for it all. She hadn't been married to a frugal man. She had been married to a student of psychological warfare. I have to go, she murmured, turning her cart and walking away so quickly she nearly ran into a pyramid of canned peaches. But as she turned the corner, she glanced back at me, and in that fleeting look, I saw a silent question, a flicker of a rebellion she had never before dared to imagine. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed my ally back. The following week, I took a bus to the next town over, to the small apartment where Annette was staying with her sister. When she opened the door and saw me, she pulled me into a fierce hug. Brenda, I've been so worried. Are you all right? We sat in her sister's small, sunny kitchen, and I told her everything. I told her about the other journals and the discovery of Dennis's school of thought. I told her about my conversations with Teresa and Yvonne. Annette listened, her expression hardening with every word. So the monster had pupils, she said, her voice grim. It makes sense. Men like that, they're too proud of their own cruelty to keep it to themselves. I'm going to expose them, Annette, I said, my voice low and steady. All of them. At the end of the year, when the final task is done, I'm going to host an event at the house, a one-year memorial for Dennis. A slow smile spread across Annette's face as she understood. A memorial, she repeated, savoring the irony. I'm going to invite them all, I said. Roger and Teresa, Clarence and Yvonne, and the other men on his list. I will invite their wives. And then I am going to read from these journals. I am going to burn their whole secret world to the ground, right there in my living room. It's dangerous, Brenda, she said, her smile fading into a look of concern. Men like that don't give up their power easily. I'm not the same woman I was 6 months ago, I told her, and I knew it was true. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer in control. My rage was a brighter, hotter fire. They took our lives. It's time we took them back. But I need your help. I need you to be there with me. Try and stop me, she said, her eyes shining with determination. For the rest of the afternoon, we planned. We sat at that small kitchen table and we plotted a revolution. We made a list of every name mentioned in the journals, every husband and every wife. We drafted an invitation, its text deceptively simple. Please join me in honoring the memory of my late husband, Dennis, on the first anniversary of his passing, for an afternoon of remembrance and revelation. As I took the bus home that evening, the heavy weight in my chest felt different. It was no longer just the burden of grief and humiliation. It was the weight of a mission, a purpose. For decades, Dennis had been the author of my story. He had written every line, dictated every chapter. Now, I held the pen. The end of the year was no longer a finish line I had to crawl towards. It was a deadline, and I, along with a growing secret army of wronged women, would be ready. The day of the memorial arrived exactly 1 year after Dennis's death. The 12 months of my ordeal were complete. I had endured every last one of his sadistic tasks. The final months had been a surreal collection of degradations. I had been forced to write a fawning public letter to the editor of the local newspaper, praising my late husband's fictitious charitable works. I had been made to spend a week volunteering for Glenda's pet charity, serving her tea and sandwiches like a common waitress. The 12th and final task was perhaps the most ironic. I was to host this very memorial, to eulogize the man who had systematically tried to erase my existence. He had intended it to be my final public act of submission. He had no idea it would be my first true act of war. The house was immaculate, prepared not for a wake, but for a reckoning. On a large table in the center of the living room, I had arranged the 16 black leather journals in a neat, ominous row. Beside them lay the 12 cream-colored envelopes, a testament to the journey I had survived. Annette was by my side, not in a housekeeper's uniform, but in a simple, dignified dress. She was not my employee today. She was my general. The guests began to arrive at 2 o'clock. Roger came with Teresa, who walked a few steps behind him, her eyes downcast. But when she saw me, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The seed of truth was sprouting. Clarence arrived with Yvonne, who clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She met my gaze with a look of terrified hope. The other men from Dennis's club filed in with their wives, the men confident and self-assured, the women with the familiar placid expressions of long-term prisoners who have forgotten what freedom feels like. Glenda made her grand entrance last, dressed in elegant black, ready to play the part of the grieving consort. She looked at the journals on the table with a flicker of confusion, but was too absorbed in her own performance to give them much thought. When everyone was settled, a tense quiet fell over the room. I stood before them, by the fireplace, and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "We are here today to remember my husband, Dennis, a man who shaped the lives of so many of us in this room, a man of hidden depths." I saw Roger and Clarence exchange a subtle, satisfied smile. They thought they knew what was coming. When Dennis died, He left me a will with a very specific set of instructions, I continued, picking up the first of the 12 envelopes. 12 tasks to be completed over 12 months. He called it a testament to my devotion. The first task was to host a dinner for his mistress, Glenda, and to publicly thank her for the joy she brought him. A collective gasp went through the room. Glenda's face flushed. The men's smiles faltered. I was also instructed to spend a month kneeling at his grave, begging his forgiveness for being an unworthy wife, I went on, my voice gaining strength. And I was forced to falsely accuse my dearest friend Annette of theft and to fire her in front of witnesses. I looked directly at Roger and Teresa. You were there for that, weren't you? Teresa flinched as if struck, while Roger's face hardened into a mask of anger. But my husband, in his meticulousness, left behind more than just a will, I said, turning to the table and placing my hand on the first journal. He left his life's work. He kept diaries. For 45 years, he documented his greatest experiment, me. I opened the first journal. He writes here, "My goal is simple, to see if it is possible to systematically deconstruct a human personality and rebuild it to my exact specifications." And for 45 years, that is what he did. He criticized, he isolated, he gaslit, he controlled, and he wrote it all down. Then I looked at the men. But his ambition grew. He decided to share his research. He decided to found a school of thought. I picked up another journal. "Roger," I said, my voice ringing through the silent room. "Dennis writes about you." Roger was particularly intrigued by the methodology of convincing a spouse that her own family is a negative influence. "He's talking about your wife's sister, Roger. He taught you how to cut Teresa off from the person who loved her most. He called it a fascinating display of applied theory." Teresa let out a strangled sob, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared at her husband, 40 years of confused pain suddenly crystallizing into a single, sharp point of truth. "My sister," she whispered. "You told me she hated you. You told me she was trying to destroy our marriage." "Be quiet, Teresa," Roger hissed, his face pale with fury. She's a hysterical old woman. But for the first time in her life, Teresa did not obey. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You're a liar. I'm calling my sister." Before Roger could stop her, she was walking out of the room, fumbling in her purse for her phone. I didn't pause. I picked up another journal. "Clarence," I said, turning to him. "Your lesson was in finance." Dennis writes, "Clarence has successfully implemented financial controls to foster a state of complete dependency in his wife, Yvonne. By treating her as a child with an allowance, he has eroded her confidence and autonomy." "Your wife isn't bad with money, Clarence. You just told her she was, because Dennis told you it was a tool of control." Yvonne stood up, her whole body trembling. "I have a degree in accounting," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried across the room like a thunderclap. "I handled my family's finances for 5 years before I married you. And you made me believe I was incompetent. You made me beg for grocery money." "Now, Yvonne, this is hardly the time or place," Clarence began, his jovial facade crumbling. "This is the perfect time and place," she retorted, a lifetime of suppressed rage finding its voice. "I'm leaving you, Clarence. And I'm hiring the best forensic accountant in the state to find out exactly how much of my money you've been controlling all these years." One by one, I went down the list. I read the entries about the other men in the room, exposing their secret cruelties, their pathetic adoptions of Dennis's sick playbook. With each revelation, another woman in the room would flinch, then weep, then straighten her back with the incandescent power of righteous fury. The room devolved into a beautiful, terrible chaos of collapsing lies. Husbands were shouting, wives were crying, but for the first time the women were not crying tears of shame. They were crying tears of liberation. In the midst of the pandemonium, Glenda came up to me, her face a mask of horror. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know he was like this. I just thought he was unhappy with you." "None of us knew, Glenda," I said, feeling a strange, unexpected pang of pity for her. "He made fools of us all." The memorial ended not with polite goodbyes, but with the slamming of doors and the screeching of tires. Some women left with their husbands, their faces set in grim, determined lines, ready for the private battles to come. Others, like Teresa and Yvonne, left alone, walking away from the wreckage of their marriages toward an unknown but finally free future. When the last car had pulled away, Annette and I stood alone in the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of broken marriages and the bright, shimmering hope of new beginnings. "You did it, Brenda," she said, taking my hand. "You freed them." "We freed them," I corrected her. The months that followed were a whirlwind. There were divorces, there were reconciliations. Teresa reconnected with her sister and, with her settlement, they opened a small bookstore together. Yvonne went back to school and got her master's degree, becoming a financial advisor for other women who had escaped controlling relationships. We had formed a strange and wonderful sisterhood, a club of survivors who met once a week in my living room, no longer a place of secrets, but a sanctuary of truth. As for the inheritance, I finally received it. And with Annette by my side as the co-director, I used every last penny of Dennis's money to establish a foundation, a safe haven for women suffering from the kind of abuse that leaves no visible scars. The journals, with all names redacted, became our most powerful tool, a textbook for therapists and a mirror for victims, showing them that they were not crazy, they were not alone, and that what was happening to them had a name. Dennis had wanted his legacy to be my destruction. He had designed a final, elaborate experiment to prove my weakness. But he failed. My weakness, forged in the fire of his cruelty for 45 years, became my strength. And his life's work, his 16 volumes of calculated evil, became his final, unintended gift to the world, the very tool we needed to undo the likes of him forever. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please, share it, because who knows? Maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.